clearing out occupiers in the Pokrovsk direction, successes of the Ukrainian armed forces near Dobropilia, and Russian losses. This is the war map on freedom. I'm Oleg Borisov. Hello? And let's start with an overview of the situation in the Pokrovsk direction. Here, Ukrainian defenders are systematically destroying Russian forces. The so-called breakthrough by the occupiers has failed. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the settlements of Pokrovsk, Rubezn, Novodian, Petrovka, Vasil, and Zolodyi Kolodets in Donetsk region have been cleared. 37 Russian army soldiers have been taken prisoner. The work to eliminate the invaders continues. The situation here is under the control of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Next, let's discuss the situation in the Torets direction. There are fewer enemy attacks recorded here, but they are still ongoing. The Russians tried to advance in the area of Delievka towards Pleshchivka, using small infantry groups. But that didn't help the Russians capture Ukrainian positions, and all attacks were repelled by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. Next, let's talk in detail about the North Slobozhansk direction. Here, the Ukrainian Defense Forces repelled 3 assaults by the occupiers in the area of Yunikivka. But here, the occupiers are attacking more from the air. There were 13 airstrikes and 11 attacks from multiple rocket launch systems recorded, which shows that the Russians are afraid to face the armed forces of Ukraine on the battlefield, since they immediately eliminate the occupier. By the way, in this same direction, the defense forces destroyed a cannon that the Russians were trying to transport across a bridge. Here's a video report from the 47th Separate Mechanized Brigade Migura unit. By the way, Ukrainian reconnaissance drones are once again showing great results not only on the battlefield, but also deep within the temporarily occupied territories. Next, let's talk in more detail about the Vovchansk direction. Here, there were assault attempts near the settlements of Kamenka and Ambarny. All attacks were repelled by the defense forces of Ukraine. Moreover, the State Border Guard Service showed this video, the destruction of a tank and enemy personnel in this direction. As a result, the Russians abandoned their positions and retreated. This video once again demonstrates that all enemy equipment is under the control of Ukrainian strike drones. But today, we won't be talking only about drones. A photo has appeared online, allegedly showing the newest Ukrainian long-range missile, Flamingo. The General Staff has not commented on this information yet. But could this be the very missile that the Ukrainian Minister of Defense mentioned earlier? We'll discuss this with Dmytro Snihyriev, a military and political analyst. Dmytro, hello, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. We're talking about the Flamingo cruise missile, which has the following technical specifications: a target engagement range of about 3,000 kilometers. But the main thing is its warhead, which weighs approximately up to a ton. And now, the main differences between the Ukrainian ballistic missile and the legendary Tomahawk. The technical specifications of the Tomahawk are a target engagement range of 1,600 kilometers. And what's notable is that the Tomahawk's warhead is 450 kilograms, which is half the weight of the Ukrainian counterpart. But what's also quite remarkable are the other technical characteristics, namely the cruising speed of the Ukrainian ballistic missile. According to experts, it's around 900 kilometers per hour. Plus, this missile is equipped with reliable satellite navigation. Moreover, it's specifically resistant to enemy electronic warfare systems and an inertial guidance system. But the main thing that's noteworthy about this missile is that it's a Ukrainian development. I'm emphasizing this for a reason. It's not just about the military aspect, but also, accordingly, the political dimension. The political dimension is the ability of the Ukrainian state and Ukraine's defense industry, even under the conditions of a full-scale Russian invasion, to produce cutting-edge weapon systems that, in terms of their tactical and technical characteristics, even surpass their Western counterparts. And what's especially noteworthy, I'll emphasize it again, is that this is a Ukrainian development. And that, in turn, means completely different rules for the use of these weapons. In other words, the Ukrainian political and military leadership will no longer need to ask for permission or, let's say, coordinate the nature of legitimate military targets on the territory of the occupying country. This is about the exclusive right of the Ukrainian political and, above all, military leadership to choose potential targets on the territory of the occupying country and, accordingly, the sovereign right of the Ukrainian side to make decisions about carrying out strikes. And this changes the rules of engagement. Moreover, it changes them drastically. The point is that until recently, the main means of striking legitimate military targets on the territory of the occupying country were either American atoms, with their technical specifications, namely a range of 300 kilometers, or Storm Shadow missiles made in the UK, or the joint Franco-British, French-British, and English manufacturing capabilities in the form of Scalp cruise missiles. But again, let me explain, the range for striking targets is limited, no more than 300 kilometers. But in our case, we're talking about 3,000 kilometers. Let me remind you of the most recent unique incident, the strike on the oil refinery in Ukhta. The distance from the line of contact was 2,000 kilometers. This came as a complete shock to the Russian side. And we were talking about the capabilities of drones, where the warhead is absolutely incomparable to the warhead of the Ukrainian Flamingo. That's what we're talking about. This is a fundamental change in the rules of warfare. Now, all key enterprises of the Russian military-industrial complex and oil refining sector are within the potential strike zone of the Ukrainian side. And it's no coincidence that information about the Ukrainian development emerges precisely at the time of the Ukrainian president's meeting with the American president. And this, in turn, serves as so-called additional cards in Ukraine's vision for ending the war.
Dmitry, let's also talk about the situation inside Ukraine. Meanwhile, in the North Slobozansky direction, the defense forces spectacularly destroyed a Russian artillery piece. The occupiers hitched it to a truck and tried to move it across the river using a damaged bridge. But moreover, there is also information about the situation around Dobropilya. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported that occupiers' equipment has already been destroyed. Russian occupiers have been taken prisoner, and settlements have been liberated. How would you assess the situation there?
I'll actually provide even more detailed information about the losses suffered by the occupying forces. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the irrecoverable losses, that is, the so-called 200s, amount to 984 personnel. In other words, that's practically a battalion tactical group of the occupiers' armed forces, about 1,000 people. Well, it's hard to even call them people. Personnel. Sanitary losses, the so-called 300ths, are about 355. But most importantly, the exchange fund has been replenished. And the exchange fund is actually the most interesting part. According to the Ukrainian side, that's about 40 Russian servicemen taken prisoner. And this, in turn, strengthens the Ukrainian side's position in negotiations regarding the return of Ukrainian prisoners of war. But what's most remarkable is the loss of heavy armored vehicles by the occupiers, 11 tanks destroyed. This indicates that the occupiers were hastily changing their tactics and strategy in conducting combat operations in the Dobropilya direction. If previously heavy armored vehicles were practically not used, and instead the tactic was to deploy small assault groups of 8 to 12 people, but in large numbers, now, as we can see, the combined nature of attacks on the positions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces and the number of destroyed armored vehicles point to the increased capabilities of Ukrainian drone systems and strike assets in destroying these types of weapons used by the Russian occupation army. It should also be noted that 8 armored fighting vehicles were destroyed, and notably, 112 units of automotive and motorcycle equipment as well. And as a result, due to the successful actions of the Ukrainian Defense Forces, a number of settlements were deoccupied: Fruzk, Rubizn, Novodarnov, Petrovka, Vasil, and Zolotoy Kolodets. And most importantly, the Ukrainian Defense Forces thwarted, first and foremost, the political aspect of the Russian troops' offensive in the Dobripilya direction. It was no coincidence that this coincided with the high-level meeting. We're talking about the meeting between the American president and the Russian dictator, where the latter tried to use recent tactical successes in the Dobripilya direction as leverage, not so much against the Ukrainian side, but rather to pressure the American side, attempting to push through his own vision for ending the war in Ukraine. And that means so-called territorial concessions from Ukraine. In other words, the successes of the Ukrainian defense forces in the Dobripilya direction are, above all, a political factor. Thanks to the coordinated actions of the Ukrainian defense forces, the Russian political leadership's plans to dictate their terms to our strategic partners and, accordingly, to the Ukrainian political leadership, were thwarted at this critical moment. At this point, there is no threat of a breakthrough toward Dobripilya. In Pokrovsk itself, stabilization measures are underway to eliminate the remaining assault groups of Russian occupiers who managed to break directly into the urban area. It should be noted that the Ukrainian General Staff acted successfully, promptly assessing the risks that arose as a result of the breakthrough by the Russian occupiers and, accordingly, redeploying the most combat-ready units of the 1st Army Corps Azov to this area, which made it possible to stabilize the situation. Plus, there was coordinated action with neighboring units, namely the 93rd Colony Yar Brigade, the legendary brigade that carried out successful battles in the area of Pokrovsk and Vasil, liberating these settlements. And what's most remarkable is that, at this point, the threat of the occupiers breaking through to the main locations of the Ukrainian defense forces near the settlement of Donetsk has essentially been eliminated. So, we can say that in the Dobripilya direction, despite all the efforts of the Russian troops, the Ukrainian defense forces have seized the tactical initiative and have not allowed the occupiers to achieve either the military or political objectives of further breaking through into Ukrainian territory. But separately, dear viewers, I would also like to point out the inconsistency of information in Western media regarding the so-called tactical successes of the Russian occupiers when Western outlets reported breakthroughs of Ukrainian defense forces positions as deep as 18 kilometers. What's notable is that these so-called military analysts didn't even look at the map of the combat operations. And in some Western media, there was information being spread about the critical condition of the Ukrainian defense forces and claims that the next 48 days would supposedly be decisive in the military confrontation between the Ukrainian defense forces and the Russian occupiers in the Donetsk direction. As we can see, the Ukrainian defense forces have set the record straight regarding these reports, which, to put it mildly, do not correspond to reality and have put a definitive end to the plans of the Russian military and political leadership.
Dmitro, there's also some important information to discuss. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Mr. Syrsky, said that the Ukrainian army is betting on high-tech weaponry. In particular, this year it is planned to deliver 15,000 ground-based robotic platforms of various types to the troops. Tell us about this innovation and how it will affect the situation on the battlefield and reduce the risk of military casualties.
It's already having an impact. We're talking about the fact that these robotic systems are already being used to evacuate wounded Ukrainian soldiers. There are already positive examples of using these robotic systems. For example, the ground drones Maya, the 500th Brigade of Kardia, saved the life of a wounded Ukrainian soldier, covering a record distance of 3 to 4 kilometers along the route, all while under heavy fire from the Russian occupiers. We're also talking about the successful use of the ground logistics drone Thor by the 813th Brigade of the National Guard Kardia, where, similarly, successful evacuation operations were carried out for severely wounded Ukrainian soldiers. A similar situation occurred during the mass use of robotic ground systems for the evacuation of wounded Ukrainian soldiers, which was documented, accordingly, by the 118th Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Even just the list of Ukrainian Defense Forces units that are already using robotic ground systems to save the lives of wounded soldiers, let's be honest, it's impressive to see such widespread adoption of these innovations. But it's not just about robotic systems designed to evacuate and save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. We're also talking about robotic systems that are being used by Ukraine's defense forces during breakthroughs of Russian military positions. Moreover, the Russians are noting their widespread use both in the Kuban direction, which is the Kharkiv region, and, accordingly, in the Donetsk direction, specifically in the area of the peaceful city of Dobropilya and, likewise, in the area of Lyman, where Ukraine's defense forces are making extensive use of these robotic systems. It should be noted that, according to estimates by the Ukrainian military command, up to 15,000 robotic systems are expected next year. This indicates a high level of integration of the Ukrainian defense industry into the overall system of Ukrainian and European security. This involves the exchange not only of experience, but also of advanced technologies with leading European manufacturers. First and foremost, we're talking about the German company Rheinmetall, thanks to which such cooperation between Ukrainian enterprises has been established, particularly in expanding the segment of robotic systems.
Dmytro, thank you so much for taking the time to join our broadcast. Dmytro Snayerev, military and political analyst, was with us live.